Good morning. I'm sorry I can't be there this morning. I'm in isolation. Meredith's got coronavirus and a bit of a scratchy throat. James didn't even know he had it, but he's tested positive this morning. And I'm in isolation because I'm a close contact. So I'm held hostage in a house full of hypochondriacs, but we're going okay. Thank you for all those who've shown their concern. So anyway, I thought I'd record this because the prep's done and it's a bit late to ask anybody else. So we're going to have a look at Ecclesiastes 3, the second half, and chapter 4. Hopefully Roz has prayed and we're ready to go. Let's begin. I think one of the things that I don't like about some of the YouTube and Facebook and Twitter movements recently is the way that we label people. There's a word that you might have heard it, a Karen. A Karen is someone who complains about how they're being treated poorly, complains about how things are not right and things are wrong. And what I don't like about that thing is that you get a YouTube clip or a Twitter clip and it just circulates and we're all looking at that person, poking fingers at them, laughing at them. And what we forget is that this is something we all do. We all have those moments where we feel like this is not right. And it's funny, but it's kind of unfair to take someone at their worst day when they just couldn't cope anymore. And it's all coming out. It's kind of wrong to label them for the rest of their life because we don't know their story and we don't know what they were going through. And I think we've all been Karens. I've certainly had those moments where I felt like I can't take any more of this. This is not right. This is not how it's supposed to be. And I feel like Ecclesiastes 3, the second half, and chapter 4 is kind of just a dose of reality that the author's giving us to help us not be Karens, to help us to actually realize, yes, there are things wrong in the world. It reminds me of Romans chapter 8, where the apostle says that the world is in bondage to decay and it's waiting for liberation when Christ returns. And it's almost a list of the things that are wrong with the world, this chapter and a half. So we're going to jump in and have a look at that. And I think once we understand and our expectations become real, that yes, there are going to be these things happen in our lives, but we can find a place for our hope, then I think we'll be able to cope better. So let's jump in. Chapter 3, verse 16. And the first thing we notice is that there's wickedness where it shouldn't be. And this is something that's particularly shocking. If you look at verse 16, in the place of judgment and in the place of righteousness. Two places where wickedness should not be. Like the place of judgment, you go to court to have things put right, and the judge is corrupt. You call the police and they want a bribe, or they won't do anything because you're not a mate. And worse than that in the churches. And we've seen that places in the church where there's been wicked people sheltered and harboured, and they've just kept getting away with their wickedness. And we know it's wrong. We hate it, don't we? And we've seen that in churches, and we wonder, why did they do that? And we've seen how the outrage at those things is even greater. And it's kind of a reminder that all of us are evil. There's selfishness in all of us, and it will come out in all of us. And so when we appoint a human being as a judge, when we appoint a human being as a prosecutor, when we appoint a human being as a prime minister, and when we appoint a human being as a clergyman or whatever, their wickedness will come out. But verse 17 tells us what God does about that. God will judge the righteous and the wicked. That's God's response to wickedness everywhere, is God reminds us that he will judge. And the next few verses outline for us how God judges. You know, there's a time for everything. God judges. There's a time for everything. That is, God reminds us that we are not in control. God judges us by showing us that we are mortal. We all die. And the next few verses focus on that. The fate of people and the fate of animals is the same. We all go back to the dust. We all go back to inanimate matter. There's a point for each one of us, a time for each one of us, and we're not in control of that time. There's a time for each one of us when we die. And that's God's judgment. That's God judging this wickedness and stopping it. There's two ways that this is God's judgment, that we all die, that we are mortal. God makes us mortal as a judgment. There's two ways that is an appropriate response to wickedness of humanity everywhere, in the place of righteousness and in the place of judgment. One is that it stops the ability of that wickedness to continue. So I've just got a few examples here. Let me grab them for you. Fidel Castro was born in August 1926 and he died in November 2016, and he killed about 150,000 people. But not just anybody. What was particular about Fidel Castro's reign is that if you criticised him or if you're a political opponent, he would have you killed without a trial, without evidence, without a judgment of any kind. Just kill them. And so there was an unrighteousness about his reign. 150,000 people killed. And that's not counting the people who died from lack of medicine and lack of food and all those kind of things when he imposed his economic system on people who were just trying to survive. What would have happened if he didn't die in November 2016? If he kept living, what would have happened? Stalin killed 20 million people. Some in the same way as Fidel Castro, he just kind of, Stalin would purge his enemies. But not just his enemies, anybody who he thought might be an enemy. He would have purges through his supporters. You weren't supporting him enough, you'd get killed. 20 million people. And a lot of them farmers, where the communist authorities would come into a village, round up all the grain, ship it away on trucks, and leave the people to starve, because Mother Russia needed the export dollars. So that it wasn't just that they were feeding themselves, but they would sell that grain overseas and let their people starve. Mao Zedong, 30 million people. Same thing, except in some ways worse. 1893 to 1976. That's when Mao lived. Mao actually rounded people up off their farms and moved them into communes, and he was modernizing his country. But the same thing, he would tell people how to do their farming. He knew nothing about farming, but he would tell farmers how to do it, and everybody in the whole country had to do it his way, and there was huge crop failures. What would have happened if Mao Zedong lived for 200 years and not just how long he lived? What would happen if Stalin was still alive now and still in charge over there? What would the world be like? What would... God judges and says, enough is enough. I'm going to limit the amount of damage any individual human being can do. Everybody is mortal. But the second thing is, it's a warning to us, isn't it? We're all going to die and we're all going to face judgment. And are you ready for that? Are you aware of that? Live your life in light of the fact that you're not in charge. You're not going to get away with it. God is going to judge you. That's the good news there, that God does. And that's why we're mortal. So that our hope won't be in what we can achieve here and oppress others, but in eternity. So that's the first thing that this author sees, is that there's wickedness everywhere, and wickedness where it shouldn't be, but God judges. But that judgment comes upon us all, and it's actually a burden to us all, because we have that mortality, number one, but we also have an uncertainty. So verse 20, for example, of chapter 3, all are going to the same place, all come from dust and all return to dust. But verse 21 also brings out the uncertainty of that. We all die, and many of us have that feeling that, well, we don't know what happens next. Who knows if the spirit of people rises upward and the spirit of animals goes down to the earth? Ultimately, we don't know what's going to happen to us. Have I been good enough? Have I not been good enough? Is there a heaven? Is there an afterlife? These are questions people ask over and over and over again, because we hit the ceiling. We don't know enough. We don't live long enough. We don't come back. We can't tell. Some secularists, and it's kind of been a modern movement in the last 100 years, as science has begun to understand more and more and more about human beings, and it's almost like we all of a sudden discovered, wow, we're biological creatures. We return to the dust when we die. And so I had a friend at school who, if anybody ever asked him, what do you think happens to people when they die? He'd say, oh, we're worm food. And people say that as if that's something that religious people were unaware of, as if religious people are superstitious. But I'm thoughtful, and I look at the science. I know that we're biological creatures, and when we die, we're going to our bodies will decompose. But look at what Ecclesiastes said. We've known that all along. Christians have known that all along. All are going to the same place. All come from dust, all return to dust. We know that we are biological creatures, that we are part of the systems of this world. Christians know that. And we're not surprised by that. And that's the point of this Ecclesiastes, is that you not be surprised by that. You not be surprised by mortality. You not be surprised by our small place in the system. Because what we tend to do is think the world is all about us. And when we find out it's not, we come crashing down. Well, the world's not all about us, and it's going to keep running. I thought that it would rain the day you went away. No, the world keeps going as it is. So the answer then that the author gives us in the last verse in chapter 3:22, I've seen that there's nothing better than for a person to enjoy his activities, because that is his reward. You don't know what's going to come. It's that theme of contentment again. We talked about that a little bit last week, a lot last week, sorry. The idea that we enjoy our lives in the place that God has given us, and are able to find meaning and satisfaction and contentment in what we've got. That saves us from a lot of grief. And it will save us from much of the grief in the next chapter, chapter 4. There's two things that he talks about in chapter 4 mainly. The first is oppression, and the second is ambition. But let's look at the oppression. And this is written by someone who knows, and it's perhaps a bit hard for some of us to imagine the hopelessness that we're going to see here. But again, I observed all the acts of oppression being done under the sun. Look at the tears of the oppressed. They have no one to comfort them. And he echoes that in the next verse. They have no one to comfort them. And it's so bad that he thinks you're better off not being born. Now, perhaps we find that hard to imagine, but there are people even in our congregation, who have felt like, I think I might have been better off if I hadn't been born. But it's a terrible thing when masses of the population live in that kind of existence and feel like that. Imagine if you're one of the slaves building the pyramids of Egypt. Millions of slaves. Drudgery, hopelessness, no future, no way out, no escape. And that's all you could do. That was your life. Work till your body falls apart, and that's it. The hopelessness, the oppression. And you can understand someone saying, it's better not to be born than to live like this. I can understand that. But the solution again, the next problem that he raises is envy and ambition. And he says a real challenging thing in verse 4. And he challenges us to think that actually, when you think about it, all our ambition is based on envy. Look at verse 4 with me. I saw that all labour and all skilled work is due to a man's jealousy of his friend. This is futile and a pursuit of the wind. People who, and it's almost true of people who achieve great things, people who build great empires, people who do wonderful things, are often motivated by envy of their friends, by comparing themselves to others. I need to be better than them. I need to be the best. I need to achieve more. I need to do better. But he spends some time talking about the pointlessness of that. It's a fairly negative thing to say, isn't it? But I think there's a lot of truth in it. You've only got to look in schools where how kids perform in the HSC and how they feel about that is very much about who's around them. You've only got to look at how culture affects performance. So why is it that Asian students do so much better than white Anglo-Saxon students in Australia? It's culture, isn't it? And the culture's what drives those Asian students. You've got to be better. You've got to be doctor or lawyer or something. It's that looking around and seeing what others are doing that often drives us in unhelpful and unhealthy ways. Have a look at what he says in verse 5. He says, there's two choices here. The fool folds his arm and consumes his own flesh. That's kind of like a standard proverb saying, like a little more slumber, a little more sleep, and then, the farm's lost. But verse 6 is what the author in Ecclesiastes is saying about the person who works too much, about the workaholic. Better one handful with rest than two handfuls with effort and a pursuit of the wind. Because look, in verse 7, I saw futility under the sun. Verse 8, there's a person without a companion, without even a son or a brother, and there's no end to his struggles, and he's achieving wonderful things, and he's building up a kingdom. But look what he says, his eyes are still not content with riches, so who am I struggling for, he asks, and depriving myself from good. He says this is futile and a miserable task. I think the problem is that rich person doesn't ask that question. They don't ever stop and say, what am I doing all this for? Until it's too late, maybe. He's saying that there is a person who, and often we look up to this person. There's a person who has worked hard and made sacrifices to become the top of their trade or to become wealthy or rich. But the author's asking, does it do them any good? I'm going to tell you about Australia's richest person. Do you know who Australia's richest person is? It's a lady by the name of Gina Rinehart. Now, she is worth $22 billion. That's amazing. I can't imagine that much money. I don't know what you would do with it. She's the daughter of a man by the name of Lang Hancock, who was a big landowner, farmer in Western Australia at the beginning of the iron ore boom. And he started prospecting, and his daughter Gina, his only daughter, continued that on, building an iron ore empire. But this is the details of her life. This is public record. When she was 19, she married a man by the name of Greg Hayward. She had 2 kids, John and Bianca. That marriage caused her to drift apart from her dad, and she had a legal battle with her dad before he died in that time. That marriage broke up, and in 1983 she married a fellow by the name of Frank Rinehart. He was 66 when she was 29. She had 2 kids with him. He died in 1990. After he died, she found out that when he was in America before he came to Australia and married her, he was married, but he had a second family in another city. When Gina Rinehart found that out, she sued the second girlfriend to try and get her apartment because she figured it was his apartment and she owned it as his wife. She didn't succeed in that legal battle. She had 2 children, Hope and Gina. In 1992, she went to court with her stepmom, a lady by the name of Rose Porteous, who had married her father briefly before he died. And that court battle lasted for 14 years. She was in court with her stepmom for 14 years about the control of the empire. She was in court with her son and her daughter, John and Bianca, from 2011. They brought legal action, and she didn't go to her daughter and her son's wedding. In 2021, she went to court with her former partner, the former partner of her father's, and his descendants and company, and her son and daughter joined in that legal battle against her, and they're still fighting it out right now. This poor lady has been in court with members of her own family, anybody connected to her family, fighting over that $22 billion all of her life. She didn't go to her son and her daughter's wedding because they don't speak to each other. Does she stop and ask, what am I struggling for? What am I building here? What's it all about? It reminds me of the time when we bought it. My wife and I bought our first house in Sydney. At that time, the bank used to make you see a financial advisor, which is another word for salesman, when you got the loan. And so this poor financial advisor came to try and sell us, life insurance and income insurance and this and investments and whatever. Poor bloke, he wasted his time because he came and he had this spiel, he had his little presentation book, and he'd go through it and he'd ask questions like, what do you want out of retirement, Michael? And I answered honestly. I stopped, I thought about it. What do I want in my retirement? And I don't know whether I'd been aware of someone else or whether it'd been some kind of issue in my extended family. But I told him honestly what I want in my retirement. I would hope that all my children are still talking to me and we're seeing each other regularly. That's what I want out of my retirement. And the poor guy said, and financial independence? I said, I just want to, have my family around me and be getting on with people. But financial independence would be able to do it. I said, yeah, okay, financial independence would be good. So he ticked his little box and said, financial independence. And he asked me all these dumb questions. And each time he was trying to get me to think that life's all about money. And he'd kind of badger me until I said, yeah, well, if we had, if we could afford to live how we'd like to, that'd be nice. And at the end, so he ticked all the boxes and he crossed the line and said, so you need to do this and this and this and this. And I said, oh, no, thanks. No, thank you. That's not what I want to do. And he was flabbergasted. He said, and what he couldn't see was that I'm actually not living for money. There's other things that are more important to me. And I think that's what the author of Ecclesiastes wants us to think about, is what are we living for? He wants us to ask that question, what are you struggling for? What are you living for? Because he says there's two antidotes here to the problem of oppression and the problem of ambition that's actually ruining our lives. And the first one is companionship. Have a look at verses 9 to 12. And this is probably a fairly well-known, one of the more well-known sections of Ecclesiastes, because it gets a little bit poetic. It's often used at weddings, for example. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their efforts. If either falls, his companion can lift him up, but pity the one who falls without another to lift him up. If two lie down together, they can keep warm. How can one person alone keep warm? It's a picture of companionship. It's a picture of living life together, of supporting each other, of working together. It has implications for Christian fellowship, doesn't it? That you shouldn't be living your Christian life on your own. You should be part of a fellowship. You should be lifting others up when they fall, and you should be accepting the help of others when you fall. It's a picture of that. But here it's not. It has application to that. But actually, church is not what this little verse is about. It's about life in general. Don't live a life that's devoid of fellowship, of companionship. Don't live a life that's so focused on you and what you can achieve. Don't live a life that's so distant from other meaningful people in your life that you're on your own, that you're not sharing it, that you're not encouraged in that. So that's the first warning, isn't it? The antidote is companionship and seeing the value of that. But the second antidote to that oppression and that ambition is humility. Look at verse 13 with me. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer pays attention to warnings. It's better to be poor and humble than to be arrogant, than to be unable to be warned, unable to be spoken to. Don't be one of those people. And I think our culture is moving in this direction where we can't hear the warnings of God. We've had 2 years of coronavirus. Those vulnerable people at the edge of life, many of them have died. And a coronavirus has made us highly aware of our mortality. But let me ask you a question. Has that driven people to God or away from God? Has anybody stopped and said, hey, we're not in control of life? We perhaps need to kind of humble ourselves and listen to God? Have you done that? I don't think many of our politicians and the big movers and shakers have realized this is a warning to us. This is God's judgment saying, you're not in control. You're not going to set the agenda. There's a time for everything, and I will decide when it happens. So there's a warning there, and are we still able to listen to those warnings? Better to be poor, young, powerless, and able to take God's warnings than to be rich and powerful, but dead to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. He tells the story of a man who came and was the king, and but he says, look, that's pointless too, because when he passed, everyone followed someone else and no one remembered him. I don't know whether he's talking about something in his experience. Maybe he's thinking of those times when King David was king, but how quickly did everybody start following Absalom, his son, when Absalom was kind of doing a little mini rebellion? What's it all worth? Better to be someone who can listen to God and who can follow God. He said it's pointless and it's futile to be unable to hear what God's saying. So if we trust in power, if we're oppressing others to make ourselves rich, if we're living in the other side where we're those who are being oppressed, if we're living without companionship because we're just all about getting ahead, if we look around and realize our days are numbered and we don't know when God will call that number. We see the wickedness in our world. The answer is to take joy in where we can find it, to find contentment and to learn how to live in this world without being outraged. Don't be a Karen, but to be someone who is humble and able to listen to God. And these lessons made me think of James. And if you could, flick with me now to James. So we're going to the New Testament, past all of Paul's letters, all the Ians, Corinthians, Colossians, keep going, Timothy, Hebrews, it's after Hebrews, isn't it? James, chapter 4, a warning similar to this warning in Ecclesiastes. So just three things I'm going to leave us with. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such a city and spend a year there and do business and make a profit. You don't even know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be, for you are like smoke that appears for a little while, then vanishes." That's got all the same warnings in it, hasn't it? You're not in control, and your life is short, and it's God who decides what happens. So it's the same warning. And the solution, the correct attitude, the attitude that will help us to get the most out of life is in verse 15 of James 4. Instead, you should say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or do that. You see, there's nothing wrong with running a business. There's nothing wrong with having an ambition to achieve things with your art or your skill or your career. But there's a humility that says, I know God gave me this gift and I know God is in control, and it's if God wills, I will achieve this. 16, but you boast in your arrogance, and the boasting is evil, and it is sin. Look at 17. It is a sin for the person who knows to do what is good and doesn't do it. You see, he says, it's not about just yourself, your life, but we're here in a community. We're here in relationship with others, and we should be doing good. So we've got to remember, as the Lord wills. It's not me who's in control. I'll make my plans, but I've got to keep in those plans an awareness that it's God who's in control, that I'm not the most important person on the planet, and then I'm going to do good. And that would be something that would be good for many of our people to remember in business and commerce now. There seems to be a growing number of people who make money by squeezing others, but it's so much better to have a fruitful, profitable, even wealthy life by doing good for others. You see, there's no value to money. Have a look at chapter 5 of James. Come now, you rich people, weep and wail over the miseries that are coming on you. Your wealth is ruined and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your silver and gold are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and you will eat your flesh like fire. You stored up treasure in the last days. Look, the pay that you withheld from the workers who reap your field cries out, and the outcry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived luxuriously on the land and have indulged yourself. You have fattened your hearts and for the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the righteous man. He does not resist you. See, there's a way of living that's all about becoming bigger, greater, wealthier, more powerful. And that ends up chewing up people. And James says you don't want to be like that. Ecclesiastes is saying don't be like that. Don't separate yourself from others. But the next verse 7 of chapter 5, therefore, brothers, be patient until the Lord's coming. You see, what do we as Christians do? We recognize we're not in control, and as the Lord wills. It's God who's in control of the time. So this coronavirus epidemic, I'm home here now recording this because it's God who sets the times. There's a time for everything, and it's God who's in control of that. But we also have to do good in the moments that we have. And then we wait for God to come. He's our hope. It's Him who gives us a future. It's Him who's makes life worth living. And so perhaps one question I'll leave you with to think about this is who is your role model in life? As you live your life, and if you step back and have a look at what you do and how you live and the things that you value and the decisions you make, who are you copying? Because I think for Christians, for many of us, we just grow up and copy someone else. So I've actually been challenged in the last few years that I've got very kind of middle class values about money. And I got that from my family. And I think for many years, I just assumed that was Christian. But it's not. Middle class people are very sensible in some things, but they don't hear what James says in others. And so am I just like my parents who are not Christians? Lovely people, I'm not knocking them. But what I'm saying is, am I just like them, or have I thought like a Christian? Are you like Bill Gates or Gina Reinhardt, that you're building an empire, but you don't know why you're building it, and you're actually damaging relationships around you while you do it? Or are you like Jesus? Are you trusting God? Are you doing good? And are you waiting for the Lord? Is that shaping your life and what you do? Then when life brings its troubles, the waves of trouble, when unexpected things happen, you're not going to be a Karen. You're going to be a disciple. You're going to be a mini Jesus. You're going to be someone who makes a difference still, and someone who has meaning and purpose even in that difficulty. Well, a lot to think about. Let me encourage you to talk about that over morning tea. I won't be there to talk over it with you, but God bless you, and we'll update you as to when I'll be back. But hopefully, I think the rules will allow me to be back next Sunday. We'll see what happens. God bless you. Bye-bye.